So thank you everybody for joining us. So this is the second hackathon that we've done. If you weren't with us last time, the purpose behind the hackathon really is just to get a team of HR professionals together to talk about the challenges that you're facing or challenges that your peers have been facing and kick around some ideas as to how we find solutions. So we're joined today, and thank you for joining us. We've got Dr. Tracy Leghorn, who is the Chief HR and Health and Safety Officer for Suez. We're also joined by Toby Hoff, who's the Director of People and Culture at Hyber. As I mentioned, George Calais is joining us as a VP of HR at Donnelly Financial. Michelle Hartley is a UK HR Director who's joining us from the Bristol, Swindon area.
Swindon, yeah, that'll do.
Well. And Mark Pavlika is the founder of the Mindful HRD. So thank you all for joining us. And so those of you that don't know me, there aren't that many, but this is me. I'm Amy Stevenson, the founder of Human, and I wanted to put this together to sort of add value to the clients and the candidates that we work with. So welcome. What we've done for the second hackathon is go out to our network and go out to, obviously, to our panel to ask about the challenges that they're facing. And the first one really comes from George. So George, you're up first. I think what George was keen to look at as a challenge that some of his peers and he's been facing was how we approach individuals within an organisation, but also then maintain that consistent approach across a global organisation. So George, do you want to say a little bit more about the challenge, please?
Yeah, sure. And again, a second apologies for me because I just realized the garbage truck is coming outside. So it's that time of the day. Nice. I can see that directly outside my window. So I don't know if you can hear it, but I just want to apologize now. So basically, where I was coming from, we have multiple offices in Europe and also in Asia Pacific. And what we found at the beginning of the pandemic, for various reasons, we decided to close down all our offices in North America and in Europe, but not in Asia. So in Asia, people have been going to the office on and off. They have been taking their own precautions. Of course, we made all the adjustments that we had to make following local guidelines. So the challenge I find now, from our perspective, is how do we keep people kind of engaged and motivated across the different areas? Because what we find from a practical perspective, we've done all the kind of good things that a lot of companies did to support people at the beginning, especially in Europe where we had kind of full lockdown, and we still have all our offices kind of closed until next year. Increasingly, of course, a lot of it was based on virtual webinars, virtual meetings, things like that. Increasingly, with the feedback we get, which I'm sure everybody else is getting, is that even though people are kind of appreciative of the company, continue to support in that way, Zoom fatigue is coming in, and even if it is something really interesting, people don't want to spend any more time in front of the computer screen anymore. Conversely, in Asia, we have been able to do more things face-to-face with people. So that's one of the challenges. So how do we actually make sure that we support people in a way that's consistent across the globe, but also I find increasingly that in different countries we have different challenges based on the demographics of the location. For example, in Poland, we have the average age of the employee is about 25, 30 years old. In London, conversely, it's a lot higher. So the things that people feel that they need from the company in terms of support are very different increasingly. So I was wondering whether anybody else has faced that challenge, and if so, what perhaps you have done about it, or what advice would you have?
Has anyone faced that challenge? And I should say as well, if people are listening in and you've got something that you want to add, just pop a note in the chat and we'll add that into the conversation. Does anyone want to go first?
I mean, I'm happy to come in, Amy. I think, there's even a greater dynamic to it than that, because within each workplace, different members of the team are doing different things. I mean, for us, we've had 4,000 of our workforce, our frontline workforce, and those in our recycling plants, etc., out there doing their job in COVID secure sites. But we also at one point in time had 250 people plus who we were shielding. We had 1,200 people who we asked to go and work from home. and 500 people furloughed at one point in time. And I think the HR challenge was to make sure that you tailor your support to to those different categories of staff and the support that they need, whilst also I think the bigger issue of still feeling like one organisation, like one Suez, doing it together, and not come out of COVID with a situation, because most of support services were able to work at home and most of our operations weren't, with some kind of divide really between our people and the contribution that they've made. We were very keen to say to our people that we did need to furlough. You are making a contribution, you're helping us access government funds that will be helpful for our business moving forward. So just making sure that everybody knows that they're doing their part, even if they are different things. I don't know what other people's experiences have been.
I think so it's really interesting hearing. I think the key thing here for me is, what does consistent mean? What's important in consistent here? Full disclosure, I do not have an international team now. I did come from a previous organization at my previous place, Medallia, where we were about 1,500 people spread across various countries in the globe. I wasn't there when we were dealing with COVID, but other challenges arose where this consistency point came up. Whether it come down to things like parental leave policies, for example, which was one where we went into quite a lot of detail. And I think what I learned from that experience is that the values that guide the decisions that you make, like the process that you go through to make the decisions, is what needs to be consistent and can be. And you can communicate that to people so they feel like they are part of something bigger than their smaller units. And that they feel valued as individuals. Because what was so interesting, George, in listening to you speak, is that you are actually catering to a whole complex range of unique challenges beyond just government guidelines in local geographies. You're catering with a demographic difference that you raised. And so there will be a value set that is informing the decisions. And I think telling people that is perhaps one way to give them the consistency they might need and a sense of belonging.
Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of supplement that, Toby, I think it's a really good point. As you were talking, George, what I was thinking about was, what are your organisational kind of values that would almost be your consistency that could then be applied across country, and you could use those as your kind of guiding principles rather than a set of kind of strict decision-making pieces. And then you can be kind of transparent about how you've got to that point with each country or each location or each kind of site, depending on kind of how you're organised. But I think particularly, with the global pandemic and trying to be consistent, I think it's really hard, but that's where things like your values come into their own, isn't it? Is because they become your guiding principles, if you like, or your leadership team's guiding principles.
I'm just going to echo what everybody else has said, obviously being the last person to speak, but before I went freelance and ran my own companies, I was HR director for Lebara Mobile, which is a global telco company now, and we had very similar problems to George in that we had isolated cultures that were operating under the brand, and we're going from using different colors in the branding color, using different terminology, different tone of voice, different sets of kind of cultural aspirations in terms of how people were treated. So one of the consistency is there. The culture needs to be mirrored throughout the whole organization. Otherwise, that's where you're going to lack the consistency. And by setting some clear values across the globe or across your organization, that's where you'll have the decision making that will be formed by those values. And I think I'm obviously echoing and repeating what some of these people are saying, but having had that challenge, it is quite a long time ago now, 10 years ago, but having had that challenge ourselves, what we needed to do was work on the culture and the values together with the whole global leadership team, so that they then went and disseminated the decision making across the globe. And I think I've just yeah, I concur.
I recall, you know, the conversations we had as a board at the beginning, where we said, right, you know, let's be very clear what our priorities are here. And, you know, we had a really good debate about it. We were keen that our sort of mantra was going to be that we were going to do the right thing. And that we were going to do the right thing, firstly, by our people, secondly, by our customers, and we'd worry about the finances a little bit later on. Now, that's easy to say at the outset, and what we had to be keen about was that we could be consistent and stick to that throughout. And sometimes that has been challenging. But I think for our people to have that assurance and trust in us, we needed to demonstrate that what we said at the beginning, that we would do the right thing by our people, by the business, and contribute whatever we could to the national effort, that we have stuck by. And I think that gives you, you know, some consistency, whether that's through your processes, you know, through using your own values to do that. I think was quite helpful. Not easy, but I think it's been helpful for us whenever we've been had decisions to make, to just go right back to the beginning. Right, what did we set out to do at the beginning here? To do the right thing. What is the right thing in this set of circumstances? And as we know, it changes every Friday evening at 5 o'clock often.
I think that's really important, Tracy. I think that the values bit needs to be a constant theme that runs through, but sometimes stuff will blindside us that needs a little bit more. It needs something on top of it. A guiding principle that further enhances or further supports. And I think that's a really nice example of that.
I wonder if there's anything around kind of metrics. I mean, what I'm hearing from a number of my kind of network is they're doing pulse surveys. And I want to say, Toby, you did something on the last hackathon about a pulse survey, didn't you? And I'm just wondering, George, if you're doing any measuring of what each area needs or each country needs, because actually it might be valuable to do it differently and then almost come back with a pitch that says, you said this and here's what we did, along our kind of theme of values and what we want to be consistent on. But you can kind of then almost use it as a bit of a PR campaign as well.
Yeah, we are actually we're doing exactly that, and this is partly where this kind of anecdotal feedback I was receiving about different needs in different places actually was validated, because of course, you know, the general themes were the same, but you know, when you ask specific questions like, you know, what it is that you want more support with in your context, the responses came back a lot different depending on the location and the context of that location. I think, and thank you, this is all very useful, and going back to the point about values, we have done that work at the global level and also at the local regional level. I think what we need to do from all your comments and suggestions and thoughts is how we communicate that to people, because a lot of it comes from a lot of the challenge we have in my company is coming from, you know, perception that if we do this in this country, or you know, the other country want the same thing, and if we do it for one, we have to do it for everybody, which is not necessarily, from what I'm hearing, desirable or you know, or necessary, right? As long as you communicate to people, you know, this is what the bottom line is. We want to be there to support you and help you and make sure you're safe and all the rest of it. But at the same time, it's okay to say that in this location, for example, this is what it means for this group of people. In that location is slightly different. As long as we communicate that along those lines, basically, which is something that we haven't actually done that well, I have to admit, so far. So I really appreciate all that. It's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. And nicely linked to the next one. So we had a challenge come through. I think, Michelle, this was one of yours that you mentioned your network were challenging.
Yes.
So how are people maintaining their culture, maintaining the employer brand when everybody's working remotely? So, Michelle, if you want to elaborate, it'd be great to get everyone's perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one that's come up now regularly through my network, and I think it kind of comes back to that whole Zoom lag thing, although I shouldn't say that when we're on a Zoom session, it's amazing. People are now, certainly in businesses, are getting kind of tired, maybe fatigued of, you know, the remote nature of stuff. I think that what I'm hearing, certainly, I mean, I had a network call this morning actually that was saying the same thing, but that, you know, the novelty is well and truly worn off with the remote kind of working piece. And I think certainly for the business that I was in, they'd started to kind of migrate slowly back to the office to then have to unpick it all again. And it's just interesting to me, I guess. I'm fascinated by it really, about how people are able to kind of maintain the culture and values kind of remotely. I've done a round of research to try and kind of look at stuff, and interestingly, the CIPD sent out something, I think last week, about leading remotely that was really interesting. I'm just kind of throwing it open to the floor really. What, you know, has there been any great practices or stuff that you've seen that, you know, I could utilize and share with my group? Any thoughts?
I was on a round table last week actually with Professor Henrietta O'Connor from the University of Leicester, and they've been doing lots of work there. It was really the focus was around women and work, but fantastic statistics around the fact that, you know, in the 80s, you were talking about, you know, 1%, perhaps maybe just over 1% of people worked regularly at home. By 2019, that was still less than 5% of people. And obviously that changed rapidly through to March, beginning of April this year, to sort of well over the 45, 46, 47%. And I think for me, you know, we managed that transition very well. I wonder sometimes if some organisations have been a little bit hasty in, you know, sort of communicating that that is going to be the permanent way of life, when, you know, we've had, you know, a couple of 100 years of the, you know, industrial or working world, and only 10 months working quite differently. And I think there's still a lot to learn from, you know, really getting the best of both worlds, and, you know, trying to find a hybrid approach that works for everybody moving forward. I don't know what other people's experiences have been.
We had a that hybrid approach is probably where I'd build on. We had a very, I talked, I think, on the last hackathon about some of the things we did into lockdown 1.0, and we brought in, we have a lunch and learn series. That was something we had before lockdown, but we brought in, I was worried about the reaction that I could sense in the team with lockdown 2.0. Just as you were saying, Michelle, we did have people enjoying cautiously using the office more and more in that sort of summer month period. And it did feel like that the wind was being taken out of their sails when we just ripped that away. And I was worried about that from a, you know, we have a disproportionate impact on our team. We already do when you think about how long people spend at work. And now I think that's just gone up a whole other level with COVID. We are often the only source of consistency and normality and all those things. And I could sense this worry. So I wanted to get a bit of an emphasis on mental health, but with a focus on lockdown 2.0. And we found an excellent guest speaker to come in who did it for free. I mean, they are a mental health tech startup that integrates with Slack, and they're just using this as a chance to kind of do their bit. So he came in and spoke for free. And one of my takeaways from his talk was that people had very different reactions to it. So I got people messaging me afterwards saying, after Will's talk, I need this, I need this, I need this. But what was fascinating was that they were different. You know, I mean, literally one message said, I need less, I'm on Zoom the whole time. I need, please give me some time off Zoom. And the other one said, we do our stand up in the morning and then I don't see anybody for the rest of the day. I mean, one after the other. So what I tasked on our people manager group, I said to all the people managers, I'd like this time for it to be an individual conversation. And I'd like you all in your one-to-ones this week and next to ask the question, what support do you need to make lockdown 2.0 more bearable? And, or, you know, or even positive, like more bearable sounds negative. And I said, capture the themes for me. You don't need to tell me who, I don't want to know who said what, but I want to know the themes. And it was so interesting because there was quite a different team split. And, you know, we have seen one team, just to build on that earlier point, that have now put in dedicated slots in the day when they just interact with each other in a different manner. So they like one group is building a playlist on Spotify so that they can just share music together rather than have to be on Zoom. And that's something that they came up with. The same group is building their like playlist for Netflix and stuff they're all watching and enjoying, just so their dialogue and their communication is different. The other team was the one that I mentioned where they say they just don't see one another. So they've actually put in a couple of extra checkpoints in the day where they're making sure that people are having a bit of downtime away. You know, they're looking out for each other in a different manner. But the point was it became quite localized. I think lockdown, at a summary level, lockdown 1.0 for us was kind of let's try stuff at a company-wide level. And I'm glad we did. But lockdown 2.0 was very much, you tell us, and like, let's find those nuances and we'll give you the reins a bit. And that seems to have gone down well.
And is that done department by department, Toby? Are you seeing that there are themes across the departments?
Yeah, it was very interesting. There were. So, you know, one of our teams is very operational, and, you know, once they are sort of a service delivery team, and they were just not having any connection with colleagues beyond the sort of morning meeting. And that was really affecting them. Especially when we think, you know, it's talking about culture here, isn't it? And culture, really, it's how we behave with one another. And they were essentially saying, I'm just not, like, I'm not behaving with anybody, it's missing. Whereas we had, you know, one of our other teams, which is a bit more involved in kind of longer term strategy and is very meeting heavy, were just at their wits' end. They were like, you know, it's 75% of my day is on Zoom. It's just a nightmare. And so, you know, we did see those differences in team around what they needed, but the ideas came from the individuals within those teams.
I would support that, because in my experience, I come from a different perspective, because the way we are set up and organized with our different locations, we have a lot of, largely speaking, we have a lot of offices with small workforce populations in each. And what they tend to do, the organizational structure is such that, you know, people will have multiple colleagues in different countries, and the manager will be in a different place altogether. So even before COVID, most of the work was done remotely, either within the team or with you know, internal stakeholders, etc. So we in a way we're lucky in that respect, that, you know, people were used to operating like that. What we found though was that increasingly, for some reason that I cannot explain, even though that was the case before, Zoom meetings, there were more meetings in the diary. For some reason, people felt the need to communicate more, whereas before they didn't. I don't know what changed in their circumstances. So we actually, a lot of people kind of started kind of wondering about that. We did a lot of work with respective leaders to actually understand where that was coming from, because it was instigated by the leaders as opposed to the employees. But I would echo the point that Toby was making, that a lot of it depends on the team and their needs. We had a team, one of the few teams that worked together in one office, and the way they worked was very, very interactive, and they relied on each other being available all the time. They found it very hard to move to work from home. And very quickly they realized that the solution to that was as simple as having a Zoom meeting open all day between them. And they were free to actually mute their microphones and close the cameras. But it created the same sort of flexibility to say, hey, Toby, can I ask you a question real quick? Right, without having to chat to them and say, do you have 5 minutes, and then organize a meeting, all those kinds of things that become a little bit more bureaucratic. So they found that worked quite well. And they have it just open on the side there. They don't have any other meetings with anybody else anyway, so they don't have to worry about duplicate sessions. So it's really, I agree that a lot depends on what the team needs and what setup they have and how they operated before and how they're asked to operate now.
Yeah, I think what I see is people are missing the connection. I think they're missing that piece of water cooler chats, running to the coffee machine, walking between meetings, just happy chats, I would say. And it's challenging, isn't it, to say, oh, let's grab 5 minutes on Zoom and just talk inane stuff. But actually, I quite like the idea of having that open meeting. That's a really good shout. And we had a number of things through Teams as well, where we had, you know, groups and drop-in sessions and all that kind of stuff. But the open Zoom's a good idea. Actually, I'd not thought about that one.
I think, you know, the intensity of the day has increased so much. You know, that couple of minutes between meeting rooms, you know, have a little bit of downtime to process things. You know, it's literally gone. I had someone at Stewart when I was just out, you know, sort of talking in our sessions on Zoom, saying, you know, how was it going? They said, you know, I even feel guilty just sort of going downstairs and getting myself a coffee. I said, well, we couldn't be feeling guilty about getting a coffee. If we were at Maidenhead, we'd be making a coffee, having at least a 5 or 10 minute chat before we went back to our desks to do things. So some of this is about the culture and the psychological side of that. We've just introduced, we're just trialing some Friday focus, Friday forums, where, you know, we're inviting people to join the forums. They're randomly split on Zoom. We give them a little bit of a framework for conversation, a bit of interest, because we want a balance of sort of more home than work, but, you know, we do want it to be work related as well. And they seem to be working well, because culturally as an organisation, we spend a lot of time out together. So we encourage our support services to get out onto our operational sites. And I do think we are losing something by not having that connection. I think the challenge for us as HR professionals is, you know, finding a way to achieve that doesn't feel too mechanical.
Yeah, I think you're right, definitely. I've seen some interesting ideas. I mean, there's been some good stuff coming up when I've done my research, and there was a book actually. Deborah Corey produced an ebook recently about, I think she called it Bringing Your Values Out to Play or something, but it's a series of case studies of a number of different businesses and what they've done specifically in the pandemic to bring that culture back and kind of bring that atmosphere back. And there's some really nice ideas in there. So they had like a music business that they had set a challenge to all of their employees to create a movie trailer about working from home. So they kind of had all these great movie trailers. The Spotify playlist came through actually, which is quite interesting. Brewdog are doing a virtual bar, which I guess is similar to having an open Zoom really, but with beer, which I quite like the idea of. So there are kind of nice things out there. I just think it's just really hard, isn't it, to generate connection when you're separated by a screen. I think that's the challenge.
Leaning into what you, a bit on what George was saying with the fact that, you know, they were already contending with some of these challenges because they're a global business that's disparate. And I think leaning into what you know can still work. I think that's one role we do have as HR professionals, is the confidence in no, this bit doesn't need to change. Like this works just as well. So, you know, we to the value side of culture, you know, we have a shout outs process where people have a little bit of a budget to award one another for something that they really, if someone's really lived our values. And that's something which really is unaffected, because that's how people are doing their work. And if people deserve a shout out for doing great work that is really in line with our values, then, you know, that your question here is about maintaining, and that is one, you know, that is something which doesn't need to change. And occasionally the one bit you can do in the background is just facilitate it. You know, people forget. So if I hear colleagues say, oh, so-and-so did a really great piece of work the other day, I'll be like, oh, shout out. Off you go. And, you know, you can slightly direct them, because of course, as soon as one goes, then people think, oh yes, I meant to give that person a shout out, and you get a virtuous cycle that comes out of it.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And George, I know you need to duck out, so thank you for joining us. I hope it was helpful. And your
thank you. It was, and apologies, I have to go. I was waiting for the right time to excuse myself. So thank you for your help, and I hope to stay connected as well.
Yeah, speak to you
Bye-bye.
soon. Thanks, George. So while we're talking about culture, Tracy wanted to raise an issue that she felt would be a great topic for us to talk about. Not that's an issue at Suez, of course, but toxic workplaces and whether they still exist when you're working remotely. And I think it links in quite nicely with what we've just been speaking about. Anyways, Tracy, do you want to elaborate on the topic?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was speaking at a 2-day event last week, and we used the Hoover app for the event. And so people were able to put in questions and start themed conversations. And I was just really surprised at, you know, one of the subject areas that was talking about, you know, toxic workplaces and, you know, have organisations got more so or less so, you know, with this sort of digital approach now. And I said to Amy, this would be an interesting one to discuss on this hackathon. So probably should say shout out to the Business Transformation Network who put on that event that I've stole this idea from.
Does anyone have any a take on that? Has anyone had any experiences within your network? Or
I'm actually fortunate to work with businesses that thankfully don't have those kind of toxic, so I can't answer on it other than I would say that if they were inherent beforehand, I think they will continue because the toxic workplaces will be generated by the individuals, and if those individuals are still there, then they're going to still be toxic whether they're in the same office or not. And it could actually be worse because they're probably going to be in isolated matters such as bullying, harassment and things like that, rather than actually be on public domains or anything.
I suppose there's no visible allies either, is there, in a remote world?
I think you just sort of think about, and I don't want to be detrimental to our young people, that, live in a world that is all social media now. And, when issues or small little squabbles arise, they can become quite really big things when you're spending a lot of time, on social media or, in digital settings. And that, I think, is compounded, during lockdown, if you're actually on your own receiving some of that. In a workplace, people's behaviours are moderated to a certain degree by people that are in and around us and can hear us. So, akin to yourself, I don't think, in 25 years I've ever worked in an organisation with, such a strong culture as Suez. But we can't be naive to the fact that we've still got to deal sometimes with issues that aren't, in the best place. And how do we do that? How do we know that they're happening? How do we point them out as peers when we're not physically in the same place? And how do we help people to cope with it? I had an example come to me early on in the lockdown around, our customer services team who do a sterling job. And I'd read an article about it. It was around mental health, and it was saying, obviously customer services teams, always get some unhappy customers. And at the moment, while people are fraught and scared around COVID, they're a bit more intense in those situations if they have got a complaint. And in the workplace, you could, you're in the workplace, you can perhaps cope with it a bit better. You turn to your colleague and say, oh, that was a bit of a difficult call, and you debrief. But at home, that's someone being unkind to you in your safe space, and you haven't got someone around, to help you debrief and de-escalate that. And so, I think when we talk about toxic, it's probably being a bit extreme, but I think we do need to bear these things in mind.
I think you make a good. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over then. I was just going to say, I think it's a really good thought about being in people's homes. Working from home stuff makes a really big difference, actually, doesn't it? And it's very easy to forget that when you're just in your little Zoom bubble. You kind of forget that actually you're in someone's home, and it's very, very different. But I think that disappears quite quickly, doesn't it? When you're in the middle of X number of meetings a day, you forget that you're coming into someone's home. And I always said when I was working at home that I wasn't working from home, I was living at work, because that's how it felt. It just genuinely felt like every hour of the day I was working. I was sat up on the dining table, so we never had any kind of space to just breathe and have home space. So it does make a really big difference, and I'd forgotten about that actually. So it's a good point that you're coming into someone's home, and that is very different.
The social media parallel, I think that's really spot on as well. One of if I have to deal with any employee relations stuff at the moment, it's probably because someone has said, I got this message and look at this, and don't you think it's this? And part of my approach to a situation like that will be to try and help that individual realize that they might be applying a tone to that language. And you can, that's the challenge with something that's written down, you choose the tone in which you read it. And gone to the point with somebody who was receptive to it, where we just played a game of reading the thing over and over again with a different voice until we were both laughing. But the point being that, Yeah, and I think these can compound each other. If you imagine a customer service example where you've just really got it in the neck from a customer and really had been spoken to in a way that the organization inside wouldn't tolerate, and then you read a message from somebody when you're beat down, and that you apply a tone to it that is beat down, it spirals down. And I don't know what the magic answer is to all of that. It's really tough. I think being aware, I think explaining to one of I guess the only thing I can think of that has made a slight difference to us in that space. You know, our operations teams speak to our customers every day, and they will be on the receiving end of angry customers. That team is now doing more frequent check-ins. That was the team that called for more Zoom time because they were generally never seeing colleagues, with a bit of a chance in a way, and that's unstructured time. So that isn't sort of Zoom time with meeting agendas. It's really like, okay, how's everybody doing in the last couple of hours?
Yeah.
Thank you. And so, Toby, your challenge came next. So you wanted to talk about COVID staff and how the issues with COVID and staff. So how some people have different perspectives on COVID and how you manage those perspectives. For example, if you knew that one of your team members was, you know, less respectful of the lockdown laws, for example. Do you want to elaborate? So probably articulate it better than I could. You know,
as a business, you can control your approach, right? You can say, we are following the guidelines. This is how we've interpreted the guidelines. Whenever you're talking on behalf of the business, this is what this is what we expect of you. And that I think is sort of table stakes stuff in a way, and it links back to some of our earlier points. But to just build further on the social media point, you know, especially our more junior team members, they're all connected with one another on various different platforms, and I know are wound up by the differing views on COVID. And there is a range here that goes from somebody who is being, you know, concerned and cautious for their own reasons and experiences and their own judgment, to somebody who is a bit flippant, to somebody who might be at a rally or something, right? You can get the whole extreme. And I'd love to hear different views from this panel on, you know, where does our duty start and stop as employers, as leaders, as HR professionals? How do we cope with those differing views? Are they views? Are they just right and wrong versus the science? I mean, there's just, you know, I'd love to hear what you guys think.
Me too.
It's a super interesting topic though, isn't it? Because it comes back to that vicarious liability bit that you get in employee relations, which is, as an employer, you're wholly and solely responsible for the actions of your employees. So if you've got somebody out on a march who's then coming in the following day and hanging out with colleagues in the socially distanced office, then you've got to kind of pick up on that, because actually that's not you, that's the business, and that's the vicarious liability piece. But that's taking it to a very kind of black and white extreme level. But it's really interesting. It's a really interesting question. And again, it's one that I'd not even thought of, but I guess that's because we've got a relatively remote workforce in my previous role, so it kind of doesn't fit with us. But it's a really good point to make.
Has anyone else got experience of those kind of issues?
No, not really. The only thing I would say, I think it's you've got to take the rule from the government. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to listen to what they say, and the company has to adopt those measures whether we like them or not. And if people are poisoning the culture of the organisation by having those differing views, then I think you have to take that on an individual basis. But mostly people will, and I hope so, and maybe Toby, yours is different, where people might have differing views, but they kind of toe the line because the government, that we are following what the government says we have to. If your company is also not adopting the measures that the government are asking you to put in place, then they've got a right to go against that. But most companies, I hope and I think, are adopting the measures that are being put forward by the government.
I have found the workforce is sort of unanimously accepting of the slightly kind of headline response of, as a business, this is our approach. You know, this is how we have agreed we are going to respond to this. These are all the reasons why. And so, you know, we expect all of our team members to kind of, you know, to get on board with that. And if you do have specific concerns, of course, you know where I am. But essentially, I find it very difficult. I've tried to avoid going into the whole you are wrong. As in, if you know, if I have a colleague that comes to me and says, I just don't believe in wearing masks. You know, the science, I don't believe in the science, I don't believe, and you know, I'm not a scientist. I'm not in a position to say, well, I do, and here are all the facts, and you are wrong. So I've just really tried to avoid anything as black and white of that, and say, yes, but you understand, as a business, we need an approach to this, and this is, and do you understand how we've come to make these decisions? It's less about it when it comes to me. I'm fine with that. It's more when I realize it's affecting relationships within, you know, between colleagues. That for me is the meatier challenge, to be honest.
That's the best you can do, to be honest with you. You know, as long as, if you're not saying, yeah, I completely agree with you, don't bother wearing your mask, and then somebody else obviously then finds out that you've said that, then that's obviously going to conflict with what the government, your company has done. I think that's probably the best way to detach the decision making from yourself as well, because then, you know, you're saying, look, you know, whatever our individual beliefs are about COVID, and there are probably out of 100 people, there's going to be 100 different views. You know, we have to follow what the government has told us to do. So therefore, we are wearing masks and we are socially distancing. If you don't like it, then we'll put together some other measures where you can work remotely, or whatever it is that they have to, and they can do that in their own space. But they can't. If they come into the office, then they have to follow the rules of the office.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one. You know, I've got some lifelong friends who are, you know, engaged with on Facebook, who I count to 10 and I don't comment on some of their views, you know, because I still care about them, even if they don't think the same as me, or think actually very, very differently from me. And that takes a certain amount of control, I think, in the current situation, because I think everybody, you know, is almost at the end of their patience sometimes, in a way that, you know, in normal life we're not. And we've got to be mindful of that. We've been very keen to stick by PHE advice and the health and safety executives' advice in our environments. You know, culturally, just going back to where we were talking about earlier, you know, in the UK, we didn't walk around with masks on. In other countries throughout the world, it was very, very normal. And so we, you know, have really, our message has been, this is what the advice is, but it is down to yourself. But in making your choice, please be respectful of other people's choices. And this might sound really basic, but just be kind. You know, be kind and keep each other safe. I think we had the conversation at the beginning where, you know, we wouldn't want to get to a point where, you know, we're having to put in place procedures to deal with people who weren't, you know, doing what was the best thing by the rest of the workforce. So we've tried to do everything we can to really encourage the right behaviours.
Does that help, Toby? I know it is a real challenge. It's one that probably, hopefully, won't arise after we're out of the COVID situation. But
it does. I like that idea of linking, you know, helping them think of other areas in their life where they are counting to 10 and letting it go.
Yeah.
Because I actually think the answer will be yes in multiple places.
Yeah.
But we do somehow, you know, we expect perhaps more uniformity at work.
Yeah.
We have clearly, you know, there's been great progress in areas where we realize that is no longer and should never have been the case, and that the whole diversity and inclusion sphere is the best example of that. It's hard, I think, to put COVID in there. It is you know, because you're arguing over fact, and that is something that is a little bit more challenging. But I do really like the idea of reminding them that they probably are letting this go with a bit more of a okay in other parts of their lives. And so let's do that here as well, because ultimately we care about our colleagues.
The other thing I would just add to that as well is that we've got to be mindful of where they're getting this information from, because there is a lot of conspiracy out there about, you know, from far extreme that it's, you know, been created by the American government, you know, or it's been created by the Chinese government, and then you've got the 5G issue and all this kind of stuff that, you know, where these are being born from, because people love to piece missing information with whatever they can fill it in with. So it's just making sure that if they are bringing something to the table, that they are bringing it from a valued source with that information, rather than sort of coming up with a load of information that may have some element of truth to it, but has probably been a Chinese whisper and become something else by the time it gets to your ears. So it's just be mindful of those as well, because I've heard loads of it from various sorts of people.
That's a really good point, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry, I keep talking over you, don't I? You go for it.
Yeah.
I was just going to say it's a really good point in terms of the initial comms that I was doing when lockdown 1.0 came in. Was I was kind of almost creating a reference document that was our comms piece, but it was a reference document that was very transparent and included all of the links to where I was getting those facts from, so that everybody could kind of go off and do their own research. But here's where we've got ours, and here's why it's important to us now. So that's a good point that you just reminded me of, Mark, actually, that sometimes that transparency piece is important too, because you can kind of say, look, here's our decision for now, and here's where we've got the facts from, and that's as it stands from the company position. But yeah, it's another interesting one, isn't it, where people source their data, and that comes back to social media again for me, where you get great posts on social media that are just absolute rubbish. So yeah. It's interesting.
In your opinion, Michelle, of course. I think, for us, we're not a political organisation. We really steer away from anything like that. I think, probably my public sector NHS background has just kept me down the, what is the clinical advice telling us from Public Health England? And I think being very clear as well, because some of that's open to interpretation, to respond really quickly to say, this is what Public Health England is saying, and this is what it means in our organisation, and be really clear on that, so there aren't those arguments and debates down on the ground around that interpretation.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really important.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And then Mark's challenge was around re-engaging a workforce in a remote world. So as we're trying to bring people back into the business and then lockdown happened. Mark, do you want to elaborate on your challenge and what you wanted us to?
Yeah, I think this comes to Toby's point where, how do you maintain a culture? Was it Toby or was it George? I can't remember. It was whose comment it was. And I think, how do you keep people as motivated as they were? Because you've got different personalities. You've got some people that have really embraced it and really enjoying the benefits of working from home, because they don't have a commute, they can be near the kids, they've got the kids around, they can leave quickly and pick them up, drop them off and whatever else. That's one demographic. But then you've got other people that are living with flatmates, living on their own, really struggling to motivate themselves, get their mojo going throughout the day. And one thing that I'm really concerned about, not only with the engaging the workforce, is the mental health of everybody, because so much negativity sets in when we are on our own. And unless we are strong-minded or we have regular interaction with a human being, whether that's out in the park or whether that's on a Zoom or whatever, we tend to feel rejected. And rejection can spiral out of control, where we start to go down a negative path. And some people are really struggling in offices where I'm working at the moment, because they are feeling quite isolated, taking things quite sensitively that they would not have taken sensitively perhaps before COVID. And the only answer that I can actually give myself as to the reasons why they are feeling like that is because they're on their own and they're literally letting things accentuate within their minds, because they're on their own and they don't have that mental ability or stability within them to draw themselves out of that negativity.
So in terms of how people have managed that, is that the challenge that you want?
Yeah, and it comes to the re-engaging the workforce. So one thing that we've done since doing this is that we, and coming back to that rejection piece, is when people have been given projects. So this XYZ team have been given a project to do, and they're going to come back in a couple of weeks' time and they're going to present it to the rest of the company. We found that the ABC team or the DEF team have felt a little bit sidelined or rejected by not being asked to work on that. So I think what we're trying to do now is be a bit more inclusive with the way we approach questions. So who would like to work on this project with XYZ team, or sorry about that. We are asking for volunteers to work on XYZ. Would you like to work on this? Please, can we have some volunteers? So that's our kind of where we were trying to be proactive and trying to sort of keep the culture going by asking people to work on different projects that were needed to be done company wide. We're now making them be a little bit more inclusive by inviting other people that perhaps wouldn't normally be working on those things to feel like they're involved, because some people are feeling more left out than others.
I think, Mark, at the heart of what you're talking about is also such an important point, which is, I think, something which has been mentioned on a past hackathon here, which is that, you know, we think of all the different ways to engage our teams. A lot of the different examples have been shared on this discussion, but we should never forget that motivating them around their day-to-day work, doing great work, building their careers, achieving in their teams is the backbone of the whole thing. And if we get that right, then the other bits are very important, but they are not at the center. You know, if we get that right, then we've got an engaged workforce. If people feel like when they come to work each day, they are making progress against things that matter to them and matter to the business, then actually that workplace will become a little bit of a haven from some of that isolation and those challenges that you were talking about. And I had to smile when you were speaking, Mark, because I've always had this sort of shudder of horror and guilt when people make that comment of, you know, who we are is what we do when no one's watching. I think, my goodness, like, I get so much motivation from being around people that kick me into gear. I would watch back-to-back episodes of Escape to the Country or something if no one was watching, and I knew they never would. And now it's sort of even more sort of trash TV on Amazon. And I say that to colleagues sometimes as well, so that they realize that, hey, we get that, and that inertia can kick in when we are sort of just left on our own. And the problem with those statements like who we are is what we do when no one's watching is that you then start to develop really negative self-speak. Oh, why am I doing this? The other people, someone else is out there writing a novel, and look at me, I'm watching TV. What's wrong with me? And I think we can help the narrative and say, you know, we know, let's motivate ourselves around doing some great work here. And I really like the idea that you're opening up opportunities to a wider selection of the business. I also think, you know, sometimes we have to make decisions that a certain team is going to be given a piece of work, and if another team's been overlooked, then we've just got to explain why, you know, that's got to come through. But yeah, for me, I really like that this re-engagement discussion is a little bit on the work, you know, on the day-to-day, like how can we motivate people around that? Because of course, you know, and I'm not separating culture from that. I think we'd all agree that culture is really how we are behaving as one another, what values are informing our behavior, and that behavior happens when we're doing our work as well as the extra bits. So yeah, for me, the answer is in that, and I'd love to hear what the others would say as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw from you, Toby, on the last hackathon that you mentioned that you found some real traction with setting KPIs and kind of allowing some autonomy with the teams to set their own KPIs. And I think that would definitely be something that I'd found super successful when we were in lockdown before, was actually having that kind of, and again, it comes back to that consistency thing, doesn't it? But that consistent piece of, this is the work, here's how we're going to do it, this is when it needs to be done by, you know, all those kinds of structure pieces of signposting really help people to kind of engage. And it's not about kind of helicopter managing people, but it is about kind of having some goals and some consistency in there, I think, and that connection back to the strategy and the big goal and the work. You know, as you said, the work is the bit, you know, and the fact that you're doing it from home is periphery, but the work is the important piece, isn't it?
It's interesting. I think we've got to be mindful as we move forward, whether it's, you know, full remote working, or whether it's, you know, a return in full time to the office or hybrid, that, you know, the impact of that isn't disproportionate on different groups of people. You know, I know I refer back to some of the stats that Henrietta shared, you know, last week, and she was talking about the disproportionate impact on women that COVID has had with regards to job losses. More women have lost their jobs than men. And also, you know, the potential on career progression. For instance, in the university sector, you know, lecturers deliver lectures, but they also do a lot of research pieces. That's what they do, you know, across the summer. And during the summer and in lockdown, where women, you know, sort of retained, you know, the bulk of the childcare requirements, the amount of research and articles written by women versus men, the drop-off was huge. And so that's okay for a few months during COVID, but as we move forward, we do need to make sure that when we're distributing that work and we're distributing those projects, we're not doing it based on bias or assumptions, and that it is fully inclusive to all, you know, minority groups within our organisations. I'm not sure I've got all the answers. I'd love to hear anybody else's thoughts outside even of this conversation around that, but I do think it's something that we need to have forefront in our mind as we move forward, because we need to engage and involve all the workforce.
Thank you, Tracy. And I'm conscious of time. We've only got another couple of minutes left, but there was one challenge that came in from the network, which is an anonymous challenge. One of my connections is really struggling. They're a healthcare organisation, and they're really struggling with having to pay statutory sick pay because they can't furlough people because they're in healthcare. They really wanted to get the panel's perception of what else they can do to look after these people. And it may be a bigger discussion than the 2 minutes we've got, but if there is anything that you could add within that time, they would really appreciate it.
I think for me, being a mindfulness teacher, I think if they have access to that or support with that, it has helped and can help hugely. So I did a mindfulness at works session for a company a couple of weeks ago, and out of the 100 people, 65 people turned up for the session. It was the biggest one they've ever had. So it's what I'm trying to say, that there is appetite for that. Mindfulness has always been a bit kind of mumbo jumbo sort of 5-10 years ago, but they're actually seeing the benefits of it. And what mindfulness will tend to do is allow them to stop thinking of the future, i.e. the anxiety, stop wallowing in the past and in the sense of depression, and try and sort of take in the now and enjoy that moment. And I don't know whether that was what you were trying to referring to there, Amy, but in terms of, you know, sick pay versus furlough, what other than kind of support from the government, it's quite difficult, but offering something like that as a support for their staff to de-stress and to have an outlet for them to be able to manage their stress levels and their themselves and also their mental health would definitely be something that I advise.
I think it's important to be mindful that, you know, one of the biggest stresses on people is financial challenges. And, you know, we need to try and do what we can as organisations to help our people in that space. We have been fortunate. We have topped up our employees' pay on furlough to full pay throughout. It was about doing the right thing, not an easy thing to do, but we've done it. But also we've brought in a couple of things such as My Wages, which is a facility for employees to be able to tap into an element of their month's wages ahead of payday, so we can help people avoid those awful payday loans. It's very cost effective. And you can keep an eye, you know, on the amount of use of it to make sure that, you know, generally speaking, you know, cohorts of people aren't getting into really challenging situations. But I don't think we should underestimate the impact for people, perhaps on the lower salary levels, of, you know, being put on sick pay because they need to isolate, etc. And that's pretty significant for people, isn't it?
Thank you. And so I'm conscious of time, so I will skip through, but I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. And also next time we're going to be joined by Professor Emma Parry from Cranfield School of Management. So if there are any particular challenges, if you want to join us on the panel again, if anyone listening wants to join us on the panel, if you drop us an email, we can send you the link to register or to join us the panel. But I think one of the themes was going to be, Michelle mentioned it earlier, are your teams working from home or are they living at work? Because whatever the future looks like after lockdown, there's still going to be quite a few people that, you know, they're going to maintain the working from home, or they're certainly going to be having more of a virtual element to their role. So that will be one of the topics.
Great.
So if you want to join us, we'd love to have you. But thank you for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.